If you are joining us for the first time this morning, we extend a special welcome and invite you to fill out our online visitor card so you can receive more information about Emerson and our activities. Again, welcome to all. Today, our interim minister, the Reverend Michelle LaGrave, leads worship with support from me and our music director, Adrian Rodriguez. You'll notice that we've muted you. This helps us all to hear the service better, and we encourage you to use the chat box, where we'll also be putting links through the service. Following the worship service, we'll have coffee hour time, a chance for you to gather in smaller groups to discuss the service and what's going on in your lives. Reverend Michelle?
Good morning, everyone. This morning's service is part of our Soul Matters thematic programming on story. We're going to be telling stories about stories today. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, wherever you find yourself on your life's journey, whether you've walked in or rolled in or dialed in, whichever your pronouns, whomever you love, you are welcome here. Welcome to a new story. Welcome to a day unwritten. We gather to speak of possibility. We remember the losses. We celebrate the victories. As a people of story, we embrace the possible over the probable, weaving a story of hope. Join us in the new story. Join us in the day unwritten. Join us in the future of possibility.
Every Sunday, Unitarian Universalists across the country and around the world light a chalice as a symbol of our faith. If you have a chalice at home or perhaps a candle, we encourage you to grab one now and light it as I read the chalice lighting. We tender this flame, opening the book, turning to a page yet to be written, opening a story yet to be told. May we fill this fresh page wisely. May we write a new story into being. May we together inscribe the page with hope. And now, if you would join us in singing our opening hymn, When Your Heart is in a Holy Place.
Is in a holy place. We are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place. When we trust the wisdom in each of us, every color, every creed and kind, and we see our faces in each other's eyes, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place. We are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place. When we tell a story from deep inside, and we listen with a loving mind, and we hear our voices in each other's words, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place. We are are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place. When we share the silence of sacred space, and the God of our hearts stirs within, and we feel the power of each other's faith, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place. We are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place.
Our story today is The Whisper by Pamela Zagarenski. There once was a little girl who loved stories. She loved how the words and pictures took her to a new and secret place that existed in a world all her own. The characters became her friends, and quite often she grew to love them. One afternoon, while waiting for school to be dismissed, the little girl noticed a mysterious book perched high up on a single shelf. "What's that book?" she asked the teacher. "Oh, that is a magical book of stories. It was a gift from my grandmother when I was just about your age." "I have an idea. Would you like to borrow it for the night?" "Oh, yes, please. Thank you," said the little girl, just as the clock struck 3. The teacher gave her the book, and with great anticipation, the little girl sprinted out the door and ran all the way home. I wonder what's happening here. Is that a fox with a net? Once home, when the girl greeted her dog and ate supper, and when she was just about to burst with excitement, she escaped to her room to read. The little girl opened the book and began turning through the pages one by one. Each picture was more beautiful and curious than the next, but by the time she arrived at the very last page, she could scarcely see, for her eyes were filled with tears. Where were the words? Where were the stories? It's just not a book of stories without any words, she thought. As the girl paged through the wordless book, she heard the wind blow, and then a small whisper. "Don't be disappointed. You can imagine the words. You can imagine the stories. Start with a few simple words and imagine from there. Remember, beginnings, middles, and ends of stories can always be changed and imagined differently. There are never any rules, rights, or wrongs in imagination. Imagining just is." The whisper sounded so knowing and wise to the little girl that she opened the book to the first page and began. At first, it felt difficult to imagine a story, so she looked hard at the picture. Are the bears best friends, she wondered. Maybe the blue bear is bringing honey as a gift because, bears love honey. Blue Bear's Visit. Now that's a good title. Then she began to tell herself a story. Blue Bear arrived at the first day of spring. He promised ... She turned the page. What would await? Looking at the picture, she saw an ox, but also that little bunny hiding on the screen. And she thought, I wonder what the man is saying to that magnificent ox. Then she could hear his voice almost clearly in her ear. "Mr. Ox, you must please promise not to tell anyone, but we need your help." The story blossomed in her mind. And then she turned the page again. The words began to come more and more easily to the little girl. Then the words grew into sentences, and sentences became stories. Like The Quest. Their 100-mile journey began in a sturdy wooden boat. "Are we there yet?" asked Rabbit. "In another 2 days and 1 night," replied Lion. Oh, that's a very long time. I forgot. Please remind me again. Where are we going? Asked Rabbit. This next page, we just might see Houston's most surprising guest star of the news. The story of Tiger's Prayer. All the creatures of the land near and far would be coming, and preparations were being made. The clown in the pointed hat would play music on his accordion. The wind-up horse would jump through hoops. The tea would be served exactly at noon, because Tiger had something important to say. What would be on the next page? A birthday party. As instructed, we arrived at exactly 3:33. One four-leaf clover and a large pot of hot steeping tea had been purposely placed near the entrance of the woods. An owl perched in the tree to our left and asked, and we promptly replied with the secret password. Our job was to bring the birthday cake, vanilla with vanilla cream frosting and black raspberry filling with exactly 6 candles on top. Pan was very particular, and you could never know what to expect, but he insisted on throwing the surprise birthday party for... She turned a page and created another story. The story of the magical cloak. One night a mysterious man with an elaborate cloak sailed into our harbor. Quite quickly it became obvious to us that he was some kind of wizard or magician, for he could blow bubbles in the shapes of things. What was more extraordinary was that the bubbles, once released, became real. Before long, enormous white whales filled our once calm harbor. Amazing as it was to see, we had to do something quickly, or... What would be on the next page? Another story. This story came to her as the story of the Golden Key. That very morning, Owl told us he would pick us up at midnight. We must be on time and prepared for anything. He held the small golden key tightly in his beak. As we flew into the indigo night sky, we were ready to face... Word by word, hour after hour, the little girl imagined an entire story for each of these pages, and when the moon was full and bright, she grew sleepy and drifted off into a dream world woven out of the threads of the pictures and stories she had imagined. When she woke, the little girl felt grateful for this small, knowing whisper, and yet she already missed her new friends, the ox, the owl, the tiger. She yearned to open the book once again, but the sun was up over the horizon, and the birds were already fluttering about, chirping their morning songs. She did not want to be late to school, so she tidied herself, scooped up the book, and rushed out the door. Along the path, she met a fox holding a curiously round package. "Excuse me, little girl," said the fox. "I believe I have the words to your book. I saw them spill away, and because I am a very clever kind of fox, I caught them in my net just before they drifted too far off." "Oh, thank you," replied the little girl, feeling a little bit confused now. "Now please, before you leave, could I bother you for a small favor?" asked the fox. "Why, of course," answered the little girl. The fox thanked the little girl, and the little girl thanked the fox, and she gathered the book and the bundle of words and hurried down the path to go to school again. "I'm sorry I'm late," said the little girl, still catching her breath in the classroom. "There was a whisper, and I imagined stories for every picture, and I overslept, and the words, I didn't know that they had fallen away. But the clever fox caught them in his net, and, well, but I loved your book, and I almost forgot. Thank you. I have so many stories to tell." "I can't wait to hear," replied the teacher with a smile. And would you look at that, one last story. The Fox and the Grapes. A famished fox saw some clusters of ripe black grapes hanging from a vine. She tried all her tricks to get them. Oh, and look, the words are all scribbled out. Ah, but this fox is of the very clever kind, so she imagined her story differently, and the grapes tasted ever so sweet. The end.
Good morning. We've come to today's offering. Giving out of what is our own is a transformative act. As a community of faith, we collect an offering, not for ourselves or our congregation, but to give to others, as a collective action of our community and as a way to live out our shared values. Please give with a generous heart to support the May Share the Plate recipients, the Montrose Center. The Montrose Center empowers our community, primary lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer individuals and their families to live healthier, more fulfilling lives. And as always, 25% will go to Interfaith Ministries Meals on Wheels, feeding Houston seniors. We have 3 ways to give. You can text the number on the screen, go to the webpage for online giving, or if you prefer, you can still mail a check to the church. As you can see, Katie is there and she'll check the mail. The link to the portal will be in the chat. Thank you for sharing as you are able. And we have no music today, apparently, and that's okay. We'll just give you a couple minutes to do that.
Adrian, I think you should hum.
Oh, I was on mute. I was like, oh no, hum what? I can find some music. Our reading today is The Broken Story by Reverend Christina Leone-Tracy. This is a story about a man with a story about stories, if you will. Once upon a time, there was a man with a story. This wasn't any old once upon a time story, not one you would find on a bookshelf or hear around the campfire. This was his story, and no one else's. This story had been carefully crafted. It began before he was born, and this story told of his loves and fears, his dreams realized, and his dreams yet to come. This story was complete. It told his whole life, including those bits that still existed in his imagination. In fact, the story was so complete and he was so happy with his story that he carried it around to make sure it was safe. It was somewhat bulky and unwieldy, but he didn't mind. It was his story. The thing about the story was, it was very fragile. Made up of many pieces and held together by only his own imagination, he was worried it might break apart at any minute. And so he grew more and more protective of his story. He held it even closer. As he went about his life, he checked on the story to make sure he was following it correctly. He avoided adventure and unknowns because, well, they might break his story. And then one day, the inevitable happened. Without warning, his story broke. It was unforeseen, and he hadn't done anything wrong at all, but there it was, laying in 1,000 shattered pieces on the ground, with the sunlight glinting off the bits of the story he had so carefully protected for all those years. He was heartbroken. And since his story hadn't said to put the pieces back together, he was at a loss. What now? He sat down next to the pile of pieces and cried. A while later, maybe it was minutes, maybe it was hours, a group of people came out of the nearby building and saw him sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by a pile of broken pieces, clearly in need of help. "What happened here?" a woman asked. "My story, it's gone. I worked so hard to build it, to protect it, to keep it from harm, and now it's gone. Gone!" he cried. "Is this the story here?" a man asked. "Yes, look at it. There's nothing left of it." "It looks like it's here, not gone," said a child. "We just have to put it back together." "Put it back together? There's no way. You don't even know what it looked like. How will you put it back together if you don't even know me?" The child was tenacious. "Don't worry. With
It looks like Adrian may have frozen, so for a moment I will continue the story. The child was tenacious. "Don't worry. With all of us here to help, we'll put it back together in a way that you would never even expect. You never know, it might be more beautiful than before." And so they swept up the pieces of this man's story carefully and went together into the building from which they had emerged. They poured him some hot coffee and sang a song he had never heard before. Something about coming, again and again, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times. The song was soothing and the coffee was warm. He began to feel hope again, that his story could be put back together. And it took a long time. Maybe it was days, maybe it was years, but they got it all back together and they added new parts, and some old parts didn't fit anymore, but that was okay. The child had been right. It was more beautiful than before. And this time, the story was held together not only by his imagination, but the imagination and support of an entire community. It wasn't nearly so fragile. And it even allowed for adventure.
Please find a comfortable place to be or in your seats. Place your feet flat on the floor if you can, so that you might feel grounded, more connected to the earth, which nourishes and sustains us all. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing so, and take a deep breath in. As together, we enter into a time of meditation, followed by silence. Who dreamed you into being? What stories sat in their heart as they imagined what you would become? Who helped you imagine your story? Who helped you see your place in the story of the world? And what matters the most? Who helped you understand that you could be the author of your own unfolding? All of which is a way of asking, who listened? Who listened until you could hear yourself speak, until you trusted the voice that is your own? And what about those stories of others? those kept in cramped spaces of silence for fear of how hard and narrow this world of ours can be. Who needs your listening so their story can be set free? Whose story needs held in your heart? So know its worth is entering into the world. We say it is about listening, but really it's about love. It is through affection that our stories are born. They are wooed into this world. Never forget that. Nor this. It is through loving the stories that we discover they love us back. Now let us enter into the silence together. Amen and blessed be. Our second reading comes from a book called Kitchen Table Wisdom. And in it, Rachel Naomi Remen shares a story that her grandfather, who is an Orthodox rabbi, told her. My grandfather's story of Grandmother Eve and the snake is really a story about the importance of the inner life. In the beginning of this story, Grandmother Eve is a little child, and she lives much as I did then, as a child. God is the Father, and like all fathers, He provides food and shelter and all the things necessary to life. In return, Eve obeys Him in the same way I was expected to obey my own daddy. Life goes on in the garden, much the same from day to day. Very little is asked of Eve. All the animals and plants live there together with Eve, including a tree of great beauty in the center of the garden called the tree of God's wisdom. God had offered Eve some very clear guidelines about this tree. She can eat the fruits of all the other trees, but the fruit of this tree is forbidden. In the beginning, she accepts this without question, even though the very purpose of life may be to grow into wisdom. As time goes by, even though the garden does not change, Eve changes. She begins to grow up, to become a teenager. One day, as she is passing the most beautiful tree, a snake coiled in its branches speaks to her. Eve, he says, here is one of the apples of this tree. Why not eat it? At this point, my grandfather would always explain that the snake was not really a snake, but a symbol for the human yearning for wisdom, the seductive power of the unknown, and the endless fascination that the mysterious has for human beings. The snake is the first teacher, and he addresses that part of Eve which is no longer a little girl, but is a seeker. Eve thinks back upon what God the Father said. The fruit of the tree is forbidden, but Eve is an adolescent. Like most people her age, she needs to find out for herself. She feels the magnetism of the apple. Drawn toward it, she reaches out for it, takes a bite of it. The food we eat becomes a very part of every one of our cells and is woven into the very fabric of our being. This apple is no different from any other food, said my grandfather. When Grandmother Eve eats it, the wisdom of God becomes a part of her inner life, a holy wisdom she carries inside her and not something she speaks to outside of herself. She now carries the voice of God inside every one of her cells like a little compass. As her descendants, so do we. Eating the apple made possible an enormous change in Grandmother's Eve's life. She no longer needed to live in God's house in the nursery in order to be safe. She was able to leave this protected environment because she carried God with her. She could hear him if she was willing to listen. When she ate the apple, she became an adult and gained the freedom of an adult to go out into a world of complexity, adventure, responsibility, and change, to have her own life and make her own choices. Here ends the reading. We're having more gremlins. This is just one of those days, all meant to illustrate to you that we're learning how to not be perfect and grow in our learning. So here's our message. Stories. Ah, stories. There is something primal about them, about our need to create them, tell them, share them. There is something innately human about the ways in which stories rise up from within us and emerge from us. Stories are the way in which we understand our world and our role within it. Stories give meaning to our lives. We tell stories about who we have been, where we come from, who we are now, who we want to be, and who we are becoming. Our human need to tell stories is ancient and instinctual and is probably as ancient as language itself. We humans share our stories in many ways. We act them out, draw or paint them, sing them, tell them while sitting around a campfire or the evening meal, and we write them down. Stories are not just for the arts, though, not just an artistic expression. They go much deeper than that, which is what compels us to tell them in the first place, through the arts or otherwise. We tell stories about anything of consequence, including scientific breakthroughs, as we do with Newton's famous apple. We have been telling stories for many tens of thousands of years. The oldest known and clearest evidence of humans telling stories comes from Indonesia and dates from more than 45,000 years ago. We even tell stories about telling stories, just as we are doing this morning. So far this morning, we have told at least 3 stories: The Whisper, The Broken Story, and Grandmother Eve. To them, I would like to add 2 more for your consideration. The first is Educated by Tara Westover, and the second is The Danger of a Single Story in the form of a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Adichie is a storyteller, and in her TED Talk, she speaks of the danger that occurs when we limit ourselves to a single story of who or what any human being is or could be. To that, I would add ourselves and our communities. To illustrate her point, and to avoid lifting up any one human identity over another, as well as to have some fun and be a little playful, I'll use Bella, my service dog, as an example. Most of the time, when we encounter a new person for the first time, people have a single story, a single script in their minds of what a service dog is and how they should interact with one. Their single story might be of a seeing eye dog, a medical alert dog, or a PTSD support dog for a military veteran. And it is often limited to the working aspects of the dog's life. They might be surprised to learn that there is a special command that I can give her, which allows her to interact with other people. They might be surprised to learn that I use verbal commands to direct her work. They might be surprised to learn that there are different rules for different kinds of working dogs. They might worry about the quality of her life and imagine that she only works all of the time. They might be surprised to learn that in addition to working, she also has time to play, or to exercise, or to go to a dog park and make friends, or to simply relax. Bella is a service dog for mobility. She is also a beloved companion and family member. She has favorite toys and favorite treats and favorite activities and favorite friends. She has a bedtime routine and cats who love her and a nana she loves. In other words, she is a whole personality, a personality bigger than her role as a working dog. We do something similar with each other. When we think of someone as gay or trans or disabled, or of a particular ethnicity or racialized identity, we limit our experience of them to a single story. And we do something similar with ourselves when we allow the voices of others to speak too loudly in our heads. And we do something similar with our congregations when we allow church history to dictate the story of who we are and fail to notice the ways in which our community has already changed or needs to change. We as individuals and friends and neighbors and whole communities have whole personalities. None of us is or has a single story. And we put our relationships, our communities, our congregations, and our own personal growth at risk when we limit our understanding of ourselves and each other to a single story. Voices from our past, our families, our communities can at times grow so loud they drown out our individual voices. This is part of the story which Tara Westover tells in her book, Educated. The story, her story, is about growing up in Idaho as the daughter of a father so focused on prepping for the end times, the days of abomination, that she was not allowed to go to school, not allowed to go to the doctor, attending a Mormon church where her father's theology was so extreme, they were outliers even in their own congregation, and how she almost miraculously made her way into higher education and reclaimed her own life. Tara's story is an example of a story that was broken into pieces, then put back together again, though more gradually than in the broken story. The voices from Tara's childhood, especially of her father and her brother, telling her who she was and who she could or could not be, were so loud they almost drowned out her own voice. Sometimes this happens to us as individuals from our own families. Sometimes this happens to us as a congregation, with the voices of the founders or the church history growing so loud we are in danger of being limited to a single story. In these cases, then, our work of change and growth, of personal or congregational transformation, this is the work reflected in process theology, on which we focused so much last month, and in our UU principles, which encourage us to ever search for new truth and meaning, and to encourage one another to spiritual growth. The first story we heard this morning came from a book called The Whisper, in which a child is confronted by a story without words and needs to learn to tell the story herself. Perhaps much like those ancient cave paintings which have been rediscovered by modern humans. As Unitarian Universalists, we have a tendency to focus overly much on words, on thinking, on intellectualism, and sometimes fail to notice the important roles of our sensory and emotional landscapes, our hearts, if you will. This here, you can see it. It's pretty thick. And it's printed on both sides. This is the documented history of the first 50 years of this congregation. There are no pictures in it. So I'd like to take a moment now to do an exercise with you, if you are willing. This is a journey of imagination. So find a comfortable place in your seat, close your eyes, and take a deep breath in. Imagine this congregation, Emerson UU Church, as you have experienced it, whether for the first time today, or the last 50 or so years, or for any amount of time in between. In your mind, picture the people, the scenes, the activities, the worship, the illustrations, whatever you have experienced. As we enter into a moment or two of silence, allow the voices to fall away, the words to fall away. Instead, focus on the visual landscape, the emotional landscape, the physical landscape. What do you see, hear, smell, taste? What do you feel in your body? What do you feel in your heart? As we come back together, add words back into your experiences, back into your illustrations. of life at church? What stories could you tell? What stories would you tell? There is a Unitarian Universalist theology called affect theology, articulated by the Reverend Dr. Tandeyaka, which is an umbrella theology, meaning that many theologies may be contained within it, and it is an embodied theology. In affect theology, the focus is on a practice of self-examination, in which we look for the places in our sensory, emotional, intellectual, and active lives which may be out of alignment, thus causing us to feel broken, to feel less than whole, and can be remedied by bringing ourselves into alignment in all areas of our lived experience. We will spend more time focusing on affect theology next month, but for now, let me suggest that this is one way in which articulating the Church's core values might be helpful on a congregational level. As you play with and explore Emerson's core values, you can look for the places in which they are out of alignment and use what you learn to grow as a congregation. And by the way, for those of you who participated in the recent core values workshops, both the Wednesday and the Saturday groups came up with a very similar list of Emerson's top 5 core values. The Saturday group decided that the final work of tweaking the list should be given over to the transition team. So you will be hearing more about that shortly after the transition team meets later this month. We are shaped by the stories that have been told to us and about us. We are shaped by the voices in our heads. This happens in both our personal lives and in our communal lives. And there are times when it becomes appropriate to re-examine those stories, those voices, and sometimes to break them on purpose, to discard some pieces of them, to reshape them, and to tell new and even more beautiful stories. This can happen at any point in our personal lives. In congregations, this often happens during an intentional interim ministry, and is some of the work that we have been and will continue doing over the next couple of years. Earlier this morning, I shared the story of Grandmother Eve as told by Rachel Naomi Remen's grandfather, an Orthodox rabbi. His story, their story, is a beautiful retelling of an ancient story, one which has surely had many iterations, many interpretations over the 3,000 plus years it has been told. You are probably more familiar with a Christian interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve, in which Eve is vilified and blamed for the theological concept of original sin in some Christianities. But the Remen story is quite different. Theirs is a story of original blessing, the blessing of wisdom, and the blessing of growth. When we tell our stories, there are many ways to tell them, many choices to be made, many interpretations to be had, many changes and retellings that occur over time. What will your next story be? What will Emerson's story be? From what I know of this congregation so far, I imagine it will have something to do with strength and resilience, at least in part. I'm hoping it'll have something to do with adventure and transformation as well. As we prepare to go about our lives this week, may we go forth united in the magic of story, united in song, as we hopefully sing together, we are building a new way. Do we have music? We're going to find out if we have music.
We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day. We are building a new way. We are working to be free. We are working to be free. We are working to be free. Hate and greed and jealousy. We are working to be free. We can feed our every need. We can feed our every need. We can feed our every need. Start with love, that is the seed. We can feed our every need. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Without these, this world will die. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry.
Our closing benediction this morning actually comes from the Reverend Shari Woodbury, who followed my last interim at First Unitarian Church of Omaha and is there now. May we have the courage to speak or write the stories within us that need to be told, the stories that make up our lives. May we listen with a loving mind and heart to the stories of others' lives, others here in this church, and others in our wider community and the world. Let us choose with care the stories we teach to our children, remembering that all of our stories have power and that all of our stories are connected, for all of life is one. In the name of all that is sacred in these gathered hearts, may it be so. Amen. And blessed